The silence in the brownstone was heavier than usual, smelling faintly of lavender and stale medicine. William dropped his keys on the foyer table, expecting the rhythmic click of Charlotte's heels, but heard only the rhythmic, labored wheezing of the oxygen machine from the living room. He walked in to find his mother-in-law, Eleanor, sitting alone in the dark, her wheelchair facing the cold fireplace, and a single cream-colored envelope resting on the mantelpiece with his name scrawled in Charlotte's hasty, jagged handwriting. It wasn't just a goodbye, it was a transfer of burden. If stories about silent sacrifices, hidden scars, and the cold truth behind betrayed loyalty speak to you, stay with me. This isn't just a story about cheating, it's about who stays behind to clean up the mess. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with a deliberate, mocking slowness. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It was the only sound in the sprawling townhouse on Beacon Street, a residence that had belonged to the Hayes family for 3 generations. Outside, a February blizzard was burying Boston under a foot of white silence, but inside the chill was far deeper. William Carter closed the heavy oak door behind him, shaking the snow from his wool coat. He was late. The meeting with the zoning board had run 2 hours over, and guilt pricked at him. Charlotte hated it when he was late. She would be pacing, likely holding a glass of Pinot Grigio, ready to list his failures as a husband before they even sat down for dinner. "Charlotte," he called out, his voice echoing in the high-ceiling foyer. No answer. He frowned, loosening his tie. "Char? I'm sorry about the time. The traffic on the bridge was a nightmare." Still nothing. He moved into the living room. The fire was dead, nothing but cold ash in the grate. The only light came from the street lamps filtering through the sheer curtains, casting long, skeletal shadows across the Persian rug. Then he saw the silhouette. Eleanor was there. His mother-in-law sat in her motorized wheelchair, facing the cold fireplace. Her head was lolled slightly to the side, her thin gray hair unkempt. The oxygen concentrator beside her hummed a mechanical lung, breathing for a woman who could no longer do it alone. "Eleanor!" William rushed forward, panic rising in his throat. "Where is the nurse? Where is Charlotte?" Eleanor didn't turn. She couldn't. Her stroke 2 years ago had left her paralyzed from the neck down, her speech reduced to guttural sounds and the frantic darting of her eyes. As William knelt beside her, he saw her eyes were wide open, glistening with tears that had long since dried on her papery cheeks. She was shivering. "My God, it's freezing in here," William muttered, grabbing the cashmere throw from the sofa and tucking it around her frail shoulders. He checked her oxygen tube, checked her pulse. She was stable but terrified. Her eyes locked onto his, pleading, then darted frantically toward the mantelpiece. William followed her gaze. Resting against the antique clock was a cream-colored envelope. William. His stomach turned over. It wasn't a birthday card. It wasn't a bill. It had the precise placement of a verdict. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead, and reached for the envelope. He tore it open. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, the ink smeared in places, as if the writer hadn't waited for it to dry. "William, don't come looking for me. By the time you read this, I'll be over the Atlantic. I can't do this anymore. The smell of this house, the sickness, the staring eyes of my mother, it's suffocating me. I'm dying in this marriage, William. I'm rotting. Derek makes me feel alive. He's taking me to Europe. We're not coming back. I'm leaving you the house. I'm leaving you everything, including her. She's your problem now. You were always the good one, right? The dutiful Saint William. Well, prove it. Don't hate me. I chose survival." William read the letter twice. The words swam before his eyes. Derek. The name of their financial advisor. The man who had smiled at him across the dinner table 2 weeks ago. He looked up from the paper, his breath hitching. He looked at the empty room, the cold fireplace, and finally back at the wheelchair. "She left us," William whispered, the reality crashing down on him like the snow outside. "She just left." Eleanor let out a low, keen sound, a moan of pure, unadulterated shame and grief. It was the sound of a mother realizing she had raised a monster. William crumpled the letter in his fist. He looked at the woman who had spent the last 5 years criticizing his career, his background, his suitability for her daughter. Now she was a discarded object, left in the dark by that very daughter. He could call the police. He could call social services. He could walk out that door, get in his car, and drive until the gas ran out. He had no blood relation to this woman. He owed her nothing. But as he looked into Eleanor's terrified eyes, he didn't see the tyrant of the past. He saw a human being who had been thrown away like trash. William slowly folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He walked over to the fireplace, knelt down and struck a match. "It's okay, Eleanor," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "I'm not going anywhere. Let's get this fire started." The blizzard that had swallowed the night of Charlotte's departure didn't melt for weeks. It simply hardened into dirty ice, coating the sidewalks of Back Bay in a treacherous gray glaze. Inside the townhouse, the atmosphere had calcified in much the same way. 3 weeks after the note, Amanda Foster sat in the library, her briefcase open on the mahogany desk where William used to sketch architectural drafts. Now the surface was covered in legal documents. Amanda, the family attorney who had known the Hayes clan for decades, couldn't meet William's eyes. "She's filing from Paris," Amanda said, her voice low, professional, but laced with an uncommon hesitation. "It's a no-fault divorce. She's not asking for alimony. In fact, she's waiving her claim to the townhouse entirely." William stood by the window watching a snowplow scrape against the asphalt 3 stories down. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night since Charlotte left. The dark circles under his eyes were bruising against his pale skin. "And Eleanor?" William asked, not turning around. The silence that followed was loud enough to hear the radiator pipes groaning in the walls. "The paperwork explicitly states that she relinquishes guardianship," Amanda replied, shuffling a document. "She claims that due to her emotional distress, she cannot provide the necessary care. She recommends Mrs. Hayes be moved to the state facility in Worcester. She signed the transfer orders. All they need is a countersign." William turned then. His expression wasn't angry. It was hollowed out by disbelief. "Worcester? That place is a warehouse for the forgotten? Eleanor would last a month. It is what Charlotte wants, William. It clears the board for her." William looked past Amanda through the open double doors into the living room where Eleanor sat. She was facing them. She couldn't speak, but she could hear. Her head was bowed, chin resting on her chest, a posture of absolute defeat. She knew. She knew her own daughter was trying to discard her like a piece of broken furniture. "Tear up the transfer orders," William said quietly. "William, be reasonable," Amanda warned, taking off her glasses. "You are 32 years old. You are the lead architect at Carter Industries. You have a life. If you take guardianship, you are tying yourself to a sinking ship. This woman requires 24-hour care. It will bleed your finances, your time, and your career dry." "I said tear them up." The decision wasn't made out of love. At that moment, looking at the heap of legal papers, William felt a surging resentment toward the old woman in the wheelchair. She represented the cage Charlotte had built for him. But the alternative, shipping a terrified, paralyzed woman to a state facility while her daughter drank champagne in Paris, was a cruelty he could not stomach. The consequences were immediate. By March, the sinking ship, Amanda predicted, had begun to take on water. William found himself missing the morning briefings at Carter Industries. The nurses he hired were competent but expensive, and they didn't cover the nights. The nights were his. One Tuesday late in the month, William sat in his office downtown, staring at the blueprints for the new seaport project. The lines on the paper blurred. His phone buzzed a text from the night nurse, saying she was stuck in traffic and would be 2 hours late. "William?" He looked up. It was his business partner, David. David looked at the unkempt state of William's shirt, the unshaven jaw. "You missed the client meeting with the developers," David said, his tone more concerned than accusatory. "They waited 30 minutes. I had to cover for you, said you had a family emergency." Again. "I lost track of time," William lied. He hadn't lost track. He had been on the phone with the pharmacy fighting about insurance coverage for Eleanor's medication. "You need to make a choice, Will," David said softly, closing the door. "We're building a legacy here. You can't build a skyscraper with one hand while holding up a collapsing house with the other." William looked at the model of the tower he had designed, a soaring structure of glass and steel reaching for the sky. It represented ambition, the future freedom. Then he thought of the smell of lavender and medicine, the rhythmic wheeze of the oxygen machine, and the terrified eyes of an old woman who had no one else. He stood up, grabbing his coat. I have to go, David. I'm sorry. He left the office, leaving the blueprints rolled up on his desk. As he walked out into the biting cold of the Boston evening, he felt the weight of the winter settling into his bones, heavy and permanent. He wasn't just losing his wife. He was slowly, methodically losing himself. April arrived in Boston not with flowers, but with relentless gray rain that lashed against the bay windows of the brownstone, blurring the world outside into a watercolor of smeary lights. Inside, the air was thick with the unspoken tension of a routine that neither occupant wanted, but both were forced to endure. Eleanor was not a gracious patient. Before the stroke, she had been a woman of sharp tongue and rigid standards, the kind of matriarch who inspected dust on the mantel with a white glove. Now trapped in a body that refused to obey her, her dominance had curdled into a furious, silent pride. It was a Tuesday evening when the War of Wills reached its breaking point. William was tired. He had spent the day arguing with contractors over the phone about a project he was barely managing to keep afloat, and now he sat in the dining room holding a spoon of pureed butternut squash soup. "Open, Eleanor." William said, his voice flat with exhaustion. Eleanor's lips remained pressed together in a thin, pale line. Her eyes, the only part of her that retained her old vitality, burned with a fierce, stubborn refusal. She stared not at him, but past him at the empty chair where Charlotte used to sit. "Please." William sighed, the spoon hovering. "The nurse said you didn't eat lunch. You need the strength." With a sudden jerky spasm of her left arm, the only limb she could move with any voluntary force, Eleanor struck the spoon. The orange liquid splattered across the table, staining the pristine, white tablecloth and spotting William's dress shirt. The clatter of the silver spoon hitting the floor echoed like a gunshot. William froze. He looked at the stain on his chest, then at the mess on the table. The silence stretched tight as a violin string about to snap. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, counting to 10. When he opened them, he didn't see a tyrant. He saw a woman humiliated by her own existence. He didn't yell. He didn't storm out. He simply picked up a napkin and began to wipe the table. "You think I want to be here?" William asked softly, not looking at her. "You think I want to be spoon-feeding my mother-in-law while my wife is drinking wine on the Amalfi Coast?" Eleanor made a guttural sound, a choked noise of distress. William stopped wiping. He pulled his chair closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to look at him. "She left us both, Eleanor." He said, his voice raw but steady. "She didn't just walk out on me. She walked out on you. I am the only person standing between you and a state facility where the nurses change every shift and no one knows your name. So you can hate me, you can knock the spoon out of my hand every night, but I am not going anywhere." For a long moment, Eleanor stared at him. The fire in her eyes wavered, then dimmed, replaced by a glistening well of tears. The anger drained away, leaving only a naked, terrifying vulnerability. Slowly, painfully, she lifted her left hand. It trembled violently as she reached out. Her cold, thin fingers brushed against William's wrist. It wasn't a strike, it was an anchor. William looked down at her hand, then up at her face. "You understand me?" Eleanor blinked. Once. Slow and deliberate. "One blink for yes," William asked. She blinked once again. "Two for no." She blinked twice, rapid fire. It was a small thing, a microscopic victory in the grand scheme of their tragedy, but it felt like the walls of the prison had cracked open just enough to let air in. "Okay," William whispered, turning his hand over to squeeze her fingers gently. "Okay, let's try this again." He picked up a fresh spoon. "Do you want the soup, one for yes, two for no?" Eleanor hesitated. Then she blinked twice. William almost laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You hate the squash soup?" One blink. A firm yes. "The nurse keeps making it because it's easy," William muttered, standing up. "I think there's some of that beef broth you like. I can heat that up." "Is that better?" One blink. For the first time in months, the heavy atmosphere of the house lifted slightly. As William walked to the kitchen to heat the broth, he realized something profound had shifted. They were no longer just a caretaker and a burden. They were two castaways on the same island, survivors of the same shipwreck, finally learning how to signal each other through the dark. That night after she ate, William didn't go to his study to work. He sat by the fire, opened a book, an old history of Boston architecture, and began to read aloud. He didn't look up, but he could feel her listening. The rhythm of his voice replaced the silence, and for the first time since the note on the mantel, neither of them felt completely alone. Summer in Boston was usually a time of life of sailboats on the Charles River and tourists crowding Faneuil Hall, but inside the townhouse on Beacon Street, the season only brought a suffocating heat. The thick velvet curtains, meant to keep the winter draft out, now trapped the stagnant air inside, preserving the smell of antiseptic and old paper like a tomb. It was late July when the postcard arrived. William found it sandwiched between a menacing electric bill and a glossy brochure for a wheelchair-accessible van. It was a square of vibrant, glossy cardboard that seemed to vibrate against the dull gray of the rest of the mail. On the front, a photograph of the Amalfi Coast terraced houses in pastel pinks and yellows tumbling down a cliffside into a sea of impossible turquoise. He stood in the hallway, the sweat on his back turning cold. He flipped it over. No return address. Just a foreign stamp and that familiar, jagged handwriting that he used to find charming and now found nauseating. William Positano is breathtaking. The light here changes everything. I finally feel like I can breathe again. I hope you're managing the upkeep of the house. The roof always leaks in August. Give Mother my regards. I hope she is comfortable. Best C. Best. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. Not love, not sorry, not even forgive me. Just best, as if she were signing off on a memo to a contractor she had fired. He walked into the sunroom intending to hide it in his pocket, to bury it in the trash where it belonged. But Eleanor was sharper than he gave her credit for. She was sitting by the window watching the dust motes dance in a shaft of sunlight, but the moment he entered, her head snapped toward him, her eyes dark and intelligent, locked onto the colorful square in his hand. She made a sound, a low inquiring grunt. It's nothing, Eleanor, William lied, walking past her toward the kitchen. Just spam. Real estate ads. Eleanor slammed her hand against the armrest of her chair. Thud. He stopped. He turned back. She was staring at him with a ferocity that dared him to lie again. She held out her trembling left hand, palm up. The demand was absolute. William hesitated. You don't want to read this, Elle. Trust me. She blinked once. Yes, I do. With a sigh that rattled his ribs, William walked over and placed the postcard in her hand. She couldn't lift it to her face, so he had to hold it for her, adjusting the angle so her failing eyes could focus on the script. He watched her read. He watched her eyes scan the lines about the breathtaking light and the leak in the roof. He watched for the sadness, for the maternal grief he expected. But it didn't come. Instead, Eleanor's face contorted. Her jaw worked furiously, grinding teeth together. Her chest heaved against the restraints of her chair. A tear leaked from the corner of her eye, but it wasn't the soft tear of heartbreak. It was the hot, searing tear of rage. She was reading the words of a stranger who happened to share her DNA. The callousness of, I hope she is comfortable, as if Eleanor were a pet cat left with a neighbor, was a violence all its own. Suddenly, Eleanor let out a scream. It was a broken, strangled noise, half air, half voice, but it carried the weight of a curse. She swiped at the card, knocking it from William's hand onto the floor. She looked at the postcard, then at the empty fireplace, then back at William. She blinked rapidly, pointing with her chin toward the hearth. You want me to burn it? William asked quietly. One blink. Do it. It was 80 degrees outside, far too hot for a fire, but William didn't care. He picked up the postcard, the glossy photo of the Italian paradise, mocking the gloom of their reality. He walked to the fireplace, grabbed the box of matches from the mantel, and struck one. He held the flame to the corner of the card. The blue sea curled and blackened. The pastel houses bubbled and melted. The fire ate through Charlotte's handwriting, turning her best into smoke. They watched it burn together, the smoke rising in a thin gray line up the chimney. For the first time, William felt a strange, dark kinship with the woman in the wheelchair. They weren't just victims anymore. They were co-conspirators in their hatred. The fire didn't warm the room, but it burned away the last lingering hope that Charlotte would ever come back to save them. They were on their own. 5 years had reshaped the townhouse on Beacon Street, not through renovation, but through erosion. The grand living room, once the site of high society cocktail parties, had been fully converted into a palliative care suite. The Persian rugs were rolled up, replaced by medical-grade linoleum that was easier to clean. The antique armchairs were pushed to the periphery, making way for the hospital bed that dominated the center of the room like a grim altar. William sat in the wingback chair by the window watching the snow fall. It was always snowing in his memories of this house. At 37, he looked a decade older than the man who had read that first note on the mantel. There were streaks of iron gray in his hair, and fine lines bracketed his mouth and the marks of a man who rarely smiled. He wasn't checking his watch anymore. He wasn't worrying about zoning laws or blueprints or the skyline of Boston. His world had shrunk to the four walls of this room and the rhythm of the ventilator that had replaced the oxygen concentrator 3 months ago. "Mr. Carter." William didn't jump. He turned his head slowly. Dr. Evans stood in the doorway, closing his medical bag with a soft click. The doctor had been coming twice a week for the last year. Today he had come on a Sunday. That was never good. "She's comfortable," Dr. Evans said, keeping his voice low, though Eleanor was deep in a morphine-induced sleep. "But her kidneys are shutting down. The edema in her legs is significant." William nodded, standing up to pour the doctor a cup of coffee from the thermos he kept on the sidebar. His movements were precise, economical, the movements of a seasoned nurse. "How long?" "It's hard to say. Days. Maybe less." Dr. Evans took the cup, looking at William with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "You've done an incredible job, William. Most families would have transferred her years ago. You gave her dignity. I gave her time," William corrected, his voice raspy from disuse. "She paid for it." When the doctor left, the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. William walked to the bed. Eleanor looked small beneath the heavy quilt. The fierce, terrifying woman who had thrown soup and glared at postcards was gone. In her place was a fragile bird, her skin translucent, her breathing shallow and hitched. He sat on the edge of the mattress and picked up her hand. It was cold. Over the last 5 years, this hand had been his primary form of communication. 1 squeeze for water, 2 for pain, a thumb rub for thank you. Now it was limp. He looked around the room. He had lost his job at Carter Industries 3 years ago. The partners had been understanding at first, then impatient, and finally apologetic as they bought out his shares. He hadn't fought them. He couldn't draft skyscrapers while worrying if the night nurse would show up. He had traded his legacy for this, the slow, agonizing stewardship of a dying woman. And yet, looking at her, he felt a surge of panic. What would he do when the machine stopped? Who was he if not Eleanor Hayes's guardian? Charlotte was a ghost, a rumor on social media that he had blocked years ago. His friends had stopped calling. He was the monk of Beacon Street, and this dying woman was his deity. Eleanor stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, opening just a crack. The dark eyes were cloudy, filming over with the gray haze of the end. But they found him. They always found him. She moved her lips. No sound came out, just a dry click of the tongue. "I'm here," William said, squeezing her hand. "I'm right here, Elle." She tried to move her fingers but couldn't. Instead, her gaze shifted, drifting past him toward the mahogany wall of the library, visible through the open double doors. She stared at it with a sudden, frantic intensity. "What is it?" William asked, leaning closer. "The water. The pillow." She blinked twice. "No." Her eyes darted back to the library, then to him, wide and desperate. It wasn't pain. It was urgency. It was the look of someone who had left the oven on someone who had forgotten to lock the door. "The library," William guessed. 1 blink. "Yes." "You want a book?" 2 blinks. "No." She made a sound, then a weak, rattling exhale that formed a single syllable, unintelligible to anyone but him. It sounded like lock. William frowned. The lock. The locked drawer. 1 blink. Long. Deliberate. Final. Her eyes held his for 1 more second, filled with a plea so profound it terrified him, and then they drifted shut as the exhaustion pulled her back under. William sat there, his heart hammering against his ribs. For 5 years they had shared everything, every meal, every indignity, every silence. But as the snow piled up outside, sealing them in, William realized there was one secret she had kept from him, and she was terrified of dying before she could give it to him. The end did not come with a bang, nor with the poetic final words William had read about in books. It came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, wrapped in the howling wind of a nor'easter that rattled the window panes like a thief trying to break in. William had dozed off in the wing-back chair, his chin resting on his chest, a half-empty cup of cold coffee, balanced precariously on his knee. He woke with a start not because of a noise, but because of the sudden change in the room's rhythm. The ventilator was still humming, but the cadence was wrong. It was faster, jagged, like an engine running on fumes. He was at her side in a second. "Eleanor!" Her eyes were open wide and glossy, fixed on the ceiling. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, erratic spasms. But the moment he touched her hand, her head snapped toward him with a violence that shocked him. The cloudiness he had seen earlier was gone, burned away by a final lucid surge of adrenaline. She was terrified, not of death, William realized with a jolt, but of something left undone. "I'm here," William soothed, brushing the damp hair from her forehead. "It's okay to let go, Elle. It's okay." She shook her head, a microscopic, trembling movement against the pillow. "No." Her gaze unlocked from his face and shot past him, piercing the shadows of the room to land on the open doorway of the library. She made a sound, a wet, gargling noise deep in her throat. She was trying to force air through vocal cords that hadn't worked properly in years. "The library?" William asked, his heart pounding. "The drawer?" She blinked. "Yes. What about it? Do you want me to get something?" She squeezed his hand. It was a weak, fluttering grip, like a dying bird, but the intent was ironclad. She tried to pull him closer. William leaned down, placing his ear almost against her lips. He smelled the metallic tang of illness and the faint scent of the lavender soap he used to wash her face. "Char," she rasped. The word was barely a breath. "Char. Lou. Charlotte." William pulled back slightly to look at her. "Do you want me to call her? Is that it?" Eleanor's eyes widened in panic. She blinked twice, rapidly, fiercely. "No, no." She took a ragged breath, her chest hitching. She tried again, her lips shaping a word that fought to escape the paralysis. Pill, William guessed. "Pain." She squeezed his hand again, harder, this time her nails digging into his palm. She was frustrated, angry at the prison of her own flesh. She looked at the library, then at him, then at the library again. The connection she was trying to draw was invisible to him, a thread of logic that existed only in her dying synapses. Pushed," she breathed out. William froze. "Pushed." But the effort had cost her everything. Her eyes, which had been locked on his with such intensity, suddenly lost their focus. The tension in her jaw went slack. The grip on his hand dissolved. "Eleanor?" The machine kept humming, pushing air into lungs that were no longer accepting it. The chest rose, but the light behind the eyes was gone. The frantic intelligence, the shared anger, the silent language they had built over 5 years, it all vanished in a single second, leaving behind only a shell. William stood there for a long time, the word hanging in the air between them. Pushed. It made no sense. He looked at the library, at the heavy oak desk that sat in the dark. It was just a piece of furniture. It was just a drawer where she kept old tax returns and deeds. What could be so important that she spent her final breath trying to point to it? He reached over and silenced the alarm that had just begun to beep. The sudden quiet was deafening. The storm outside seemed to roar louder, reclaiming the space. William didn't cry. He didn't feel the sharp stab of grief he expected. Instead, he felt a profound, hollow weight settling onto his shoulders. He was truly alone now. The witness was gone. He reached out and gently closed her eyes. Then he turned and walked into the library. He stood before the desk, running his hand over the cold wood. The top drawer was locked, just as it had been for 5 years. He didn't have the key. Eleanor had kept it on a chain around her neck before the stroke, and it had been lost, or so he thought, in the chaos of the hospital transfer years ago. "Pushed," he whispered to the empty room. He didn't break it open. Not yet. The night was for the dead. The morning would be for the living, and for the vultures that were sure to circle. He turned his back on the desk and went to the phone to make the call he had been dreading for half a decade. The funeral was scheduled for Friday, but the invasion began on Wednesday afternoon. William stood in the foyer, signing a receipt for a delivery of white hydrangeas Eleanor had despised lilies, calling them the perfume of death. He was wearing the same suit he had worn to the hospital morgue, a charcoal gray wool that hung loosely on his frame. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. He felt like a ghost haunting his own life, transparent and unseen amidst the sudden flurry of activity. The heavy brass knocker on the front door slammed twice. Not a hesitant tap, but a demand. William closed the door on the florist and took a deep breath. He knew who it was. The text message had come 6 hours ago from a number he hadn't saved but couldn't forget. Landing at Logan at 2. See you soon. He opened the door. The first thing that hit him was the smell. Not the cold, crisp scent of the Boston winter, but a wave of tuberose and sandalwood, expensive, overwhelming, and utterly foreign to this house of dust and medicine. "William," Charlotte said. She stood on the granite step framed by the falling snow like a spread in a fashion magazine. She was wearing black, but it was the kind of black that cost more than William's car, a structured coat with a fur collar, oversized sunglasses, and leather gloves. She looked impeccable. She looked 5 years younger than the woman who had left that note on the mantel. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, pulling off her sunglasses to reveal eyes that were dry and clear. She looked at him, her gaze raking over his unkempt hair, his tired eyes, his frayed collar. A flicker of something crossed her face. Pity, disgust. It was gone too fast to tell. "You look tired," she said, leaning in to press a cheek against his. Her skin was cold. It was like being kissed by a statue. "I haven't slept much, Charlotte." William said, his voice flat. He stepped back, creating space. "Of course. It's been an ordeal, I'm sure." However, she sighed a theatrical exhale and turned back to the open door. "Derek, darling, bring the bags in. The driver can't park there." William's jaw tightened. He watched as Derek Stone walked up the steps. The man was exactly as William remembered from the few dinner parties they had hosted years ago, tall, tanned, with the easy confidence of a man who managed hedge funds and other people's wives. He was carrying 2 Louis Vuitton weekend bags. "Hello, William," Derek said, offering a hand gloved in black leather. "My condolences. Terrible business." William stared at the hand. He didn't take it. "You can put the bags in the guest room. 2nd floor to the left." Derek's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened. He nodded and brushed past William, his shoulder checking him slightly as he moved toward the stairs. Charlotte was already in the living room. She stood in the center of the space where Eleanor's hospital bed had been only 24 hours ago. The rental company had collected it that morning, leaving deep indentations in the linoleum floor and a rectangular pale spot where the sun hadn't hit for years. "God," Charlotte murmured, wrinkling her nose. "It smells like sickness in here. We need to open the windows. Get some sage. Something." "It smells like your mother," William said, walking into the room. "It smells like the last 5 years." Charlotte turned, her expression tightening. "Don't start, William. I just got off a 7-hour flight. I am here to bury my mother. I don't need the guilt trip. I know you played the martyr. We all know." "Martyr?" William let out a short, dry laugh. "I played the son. Someone had to. And you were compensated, weren't you?" Charlotte waved a hand vaguely around the room, encompassing the peeling wallpaper and the heavy velvet drapes. "I told Amanda not to fight you on the monthly stipend. You lived here rent-free. You had your little kingdom." She walked over to the fireplace, running a gloved finger along the mantelpiece, the exact spot where she had left the note. She didn't seem to remember, or maybe she just didn't care. "We'll list the house immediately after the funeral," she announced, turning back to him. "The market in Back Bay is exploding. Derek says we could get $4 million as a tear-down renovation. Maybe 5 if we stage it right." She wasn't mourning, she was appraising. "We haven't even read the will, Charlotte," William said quietly. "Please," she scoffed, pulling off her gloves. "It's standard. I'm the only child. You're the estranged husband. I'm sure she left you a nice bonus for your time. But let's be realistic. This is Hayes' property." She walked toward the library doors. William moved instinctively, stepping in her path to block the entrance. "What?" Charlotte asked, arching an eyebrow. "The library is locked," William lied. "Why?" "I've been using it for storage. It's a mess." Charlotte stared at him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. She sensed something, a resistance that hadn't been there 5 years ago. The William she left was soft, pliable, desperate for her approval. The man standing in front of her now was made of something harder. "Fine," she said, turning away. "I need a drink. Is there anything decent in this house? Or did you drink it all during your long, lonely nights?" "There's wine in the kitchen," William said. As she walked away, the click of her heels echoing on the floorboards, William looked up the stairs where Derek had disappeared. The house felt smaller, dirtier, tainted. They had returned not to grieve but to harvest. And William realized with a sinking feeling that Eleanor's death wasn't the end of his service. It was just the beginning of the war. The wake was a masterclass in theater. Charlotte had insisted on hosting it at the townhouse immediately following the service at Trinity Church, transforming the gloomy first floor into a cocktail reception that felt more like a gallery opening than a morning ritual. William stood in the shadow of the hallway arch, nursing a glass of scotch he hadn't sipped. He watched his wife, technically still his wife, hold court in the center of the living room. She was magnificent in her grief. She dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, accepted condolences with a graceful bow of her head, and spoke in hushed, trembling tones about the tragedy of distance and the bond that never breaks. It was a lie so polished it gleamed. The guests were mostly strangers to William. They were Charlotte's people friends from her life in Europe, old acquaintances from prep school who hadn't visited Eleanor in 20 years, and business associates of Derek. They moved through the house, touching the velvet drapes and eyeing the antique silver with appraisal rather than respect. "She's handling it well, isn't she?" William turned. Derek was standing beside him, swirling a glass of red wine. He wasn't looking at Charlotte. He was looking at the crown molding on the ceiling. "She's handling it," William said neutrally. "It's a great property," Derek said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Good bones. But the layout is archaic. You'd have to gut the kitchen open up this wall here to get the river view. It could be a masterpiece." "It was a home," William said, his grip tightening on his glass. "Not a project." Derek chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "Everything is a project, William, or a liability. Speaking of which," he gestured with his glass toward the corner of the room where Eleanor's wheelchair still sat folded up against the wall. William hadn't had the heart to move it to the basement yet. "We should get that out of here before the real estate photographer comes on Monday. It's depressing." William looked at the wheelchair. The leather on the armrest was worn smooth where Eleanor's hands had gripped it during her spasms. The metal footrests were scratched. It wasn't just equipment. It was the vessel that had held her through 5 years of hell. "I'll move it," William said, his voice cold. "Good man." Derek patted him on the shoulder, a gesture of dismissal, and walked away to join a group of investors near the fireplace. By 8 p.m., the last guest had left. The house fell silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, a restless, agitated quiet. The air smelled of stale perfume and catered canapes. Charlotte kicked off her heels in the foyer and let out a long, loud groan. "God, that was exhausting. Did you see Mrs. Pembroke? She practically drooled on my coat." She walked into the living room, no longer trembling, no longer the grieving daughter. She began moving through the room, picking up empty glasses and stacking them with aggressive efficiency. "We need to order a dumpster," she said over her shoulder. William looked up from the fireplace. "A dumpster for the junk," she said, waving a hand at the built-in bookshelves that lined the far wall. "Mother's collection, those awful ceramic figurines, the clothes in the closet, the medical equipment. We can't sell the place looking like a nursing home, William. We need to stage it. Minimalist, modern." She picked up a small frame photograph from the side table. It was a picture of Eleanor and a young Charlotte on a boat in Cape Cod. Eleanor was laughing, her hair windblown. Charlotte looked at it for a second, her expression unreadable, and then tossed it face down onto the pile of things to be discarded. "It's all just clutter," she muttered. "It's her life, Charlotte," William said, stepping forward. "She died 3 days ago. Can we not strip the house bare before the grass grows on her grave?" Charlotte spun around, her eyes flashing. "Don't lecture me on timing, William. I want this done. I want to sell this mausoleum, take my share, and go back to a life that actually has a pulse. I don't want to be reminded of this stagnation." She walked over to the windows and looked out at the snowy street. "This house is cursed. It ate my father, it ate her, and it almost ate me. I'm doing us a favor by gutting it. William watched her, realizing with a sudden clarity that she wasn't just greedy. She was afraid. She was terrified of the memories this house held, terrified of the silence that might whisper her secrets back to her. She wanted to scrub the walls, not to clean them, but to silence them. You can't throw everything away, William said quietly. Some things stay. We'll see what the will says tomorrow, Charlotte snapped, turning off the lights in the living room, plunging them into semi-darkness. But until then, stay out of my way. I have a crew coming at 8 a.m. on Monday. She walked past him, heading up the stairs to the guest room where Derek was waiting. William stood alone in the dark, listening to the house settle. He looked at the library door. The dumpster was coming on Monday. He didn't have much time. He had to know what was in that drawer before the crew arrived to erase the evidence of Eleanor Hayes forever. The grandfather clock struck 2 in the morning, the sound vibrating through the floorboards like a heartbeat slowing down. The house was finally silent. Upstairs in the guest suite that used to belong to Charlotte's father, the lights were out. William had heard the heavy footsteps of Derek and the lighter, restless pacing of Charlotte until around midnight. Now, only the wind outside remained awake. William stood in the library. It was the one room in the house that hadn't been converted into a medical facility. It still smelled of leather bindings, pipe tobacco, and the dust of unread stories. The mahogany desk sat in the center of the room, a hulking shadow in the moonlight, filtering through the heavy drapes. He approached it with a flathead screwdriver he had taken from the kitchen utility drawer. He felt like a thief in his own home. He remembered Eleanor's dying eyes, the desperate, terrified urgency. Pushed. The word had been haunting him for 3 days. He knelt before the bottom right drawer. The brass lock was old, tarnished by time. He inserted the tip of the screwdriver into the gap between the drawer and the frame. He applied pressure. The wood groaned, a sharp, dry crack that sounded like a pistol shot in the silence. William froze, his eyes darting to the ceiling. He held his breath, waiting for the sound of footsteps upstairs. Nothing. Just the wind. He pushed harder. With a splintering snap, the lock gave way. The drawer slid open with a smooth, well-oiled hiss. It wasn't full of cash. It wasn't full of jewelry. It contained a single thick leather-bound journal and a large manila envelope from Sterling and Associates. Private investigations. William's hands trembled as he reached for the envelope first. He undid the string tie and slid the contents out. It was a file dated 10 years ago, the week of Eleanor's accident. The official story had always been simple. Eleanor Hayes, suffering a dizzy spell, had fallen down the main staircase. A tragic, unavoidable accident that resulted in C4 and C5 spinal trauma. But the document in William's hand wasn't the police report. It was a private investigative summary commissioned by Eleanor herself 6 months after the fall. Attached were photos of the bruising pattern on her back taken in the hospital, but never released to the insurance company. Subject injury analysis consultant. Note: the bruising on the scapula is inconsistent with a tumble. The contusions suggest high-velocity impact from 2 distinct points of contact prior to the fall, consistent with a shove from the upper torso. William felt the blood drain from his face. He put the report down and picked up the journal. He opened it to the bookmark page dated 2 days after the accident. Eleanor's handwriting was shaky, likely written with her non-dominant hand or under heavy sedation, but it was legible. October 14th. She came to the hospital today. She brought flowers. She was crying. She asked if I told the doctors. I said no. How could I? She is my only child. I remember the look in her eyes at the top of the stairs. It wasn't an accident. We were arguing about the trust fund. I told her I wouldn't release the capital for that man's investment scheme. She screamed that I was ruining her life. She lunged. She didn't trip. She lunged. I am paralyzed because my daughter wanted money, and now I have to live in this body and she has to live with what she did. I will keep her secret. It is the last thing I can do for her as a mother. But I will not let her have the money. Not now. Not ever. William sat back on his heels, the journal slipping from his fingers to the rug. The room seemed to spin. The last 5 years replayed in his mind, but the lens had shifted. Charlotte hadn't left because she was bored. She hadn't left because the house smelled of sickness or because she fell in love with Derek. She had left because every time she looked at her mother in that wheelchair, she saw the evidence of her own crime. She had fled the scene of the crime and William, poor, dutiful, ignorant William, had been left to scrub the blood off the floor. He looked up at the ceiling toward the room where his wife was sleeping. He imagined her lying there dreaming of the millions she thought she was about to inherit. She thought the slate was clean. She thought the only witness was dead. "You didn't protect her," William whispered to the ghost in the room. "You protected me." He understood now. Eleanor hadn't just been angry at the postcard. She hadn't just been difficult. She had been holding on to a rage so potent it had kept her alive for a decade. And in the end, she had entrusted that rage to him. William gathered the papers. He put the photos back in the envelope. He closed the journal. He didn't put them back in the drawer. He stood up, clutching the evidence to his chest. The fear was gone. The exhaustion was gone. In their place was a cold, hard clarity. He walked out of the library and up the stairs, moving silently past the guest room door. He went to the master bedroom, his room, and locked the door. He placed the documents on his nightstand. Tomorrow they would read the will. Charlotte expected a check. William was going to give her a reckoning. Saturday morning broke with a deceptive brightness. The sun reflected off the snow-covered street, filling the dining room with a harsh, clinical light that exposed the dust motes dancing in the air, the dust Charlotte had been so eager to sweep away. They sat around the long mahogany table like a board of directors facing a hostile takeover. Charlotte sat at the head of position she had claimed the moment she walked in. She wore a tailored black dress that screamed heiress. Her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon. Derek sat to her right, tapping away on his phone, likely checking the Nikkei index or messaging a contractor about demolition costs. William sat opposite them. He was clean-shaven now, wearing a dark suit. He looked calm, almost detached. His hands rested on the table, clasped loosely. He didn't have his phone. He didn't have a notepad. He just had the knowledge of what lay upstairs in his nightstand, burning a hole in his consciousness. Amanda Foster sat in the middle, flanked by stacks of files. She looked older than William remembered. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted her reading glasses. She had been the Hayes family attorney for 30 years. She had drafted Charlotte's prenup, Eleanor's trust, and now this final decree. "Shall we begin?" Amanda asked, her voice thin. "Please," Charlotte said, checking her diamond watch. "We have a walkthrough with the estate liquidators at noon. Let's not drag this out with sentimental poetry, Amanda. Just the assets." Amanda cleared her throat. She didn't look at Charlotte. She looked down at the document, the thick cream paper bearing the official seal of her firm. "This is the last will and testament of Eleanor Grace Hayes, dated November 14th, 5 years ago. It supersedes all previous wills and codicils." Charlotte frowned slightly. 5 years ago, that was right after I left. She must have been emotional. "She was of sound mind, Charlotte." Amanda cut in, her tone sharpening. "I videotaped the signing myself to ensure there could be no contest." Derek stopped tapping on his phone. He sensed the shift in the room's barometric pressure. Amanda began to read. "To the various charities listed in addendum, I bequeath the sum of $50,000 each." She droned on through the minor bequests, the housekeeper who had retired, the gardener, the church restoration fund. Charlotte tapped her manicured nails on the wood. Tap, tap, tap. The estate, Amanda, the house, the portfolio. Amanda took a deep breath. She turned the page. The paper crinkled loudly in the silence. Regarding the bulk of the estate, including the property at 142 Beacon Street, the holding company Hayes Ventures, and all liquid assets held in the primary trust. Charlotte sat up straighter, a predator ready to pounce. "Do I hereby explicitly disinherit my daughter Charlotte Hayes Carter." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. "Excuse me." Charlotte's voice was a whisper, a sudden crack in the porcelain facade. Amanda continued, her voice gaining strength, reading the words Eleanor had dictated with venomous precision. "I leave her nothing. Not out of spite for her departure, but as a consequence of her actions toward my person. She is aware of the debt she owes, and she has already taken more than her share." "This is a joke." Charlotte stood up, her chair screeching against the floorboards. "She was senile. She was a stroke victim. You let her write this." "Sit down, Charlotte," Amanda said, not looking up. "I'm not finished." "I will not sit down. This is insane. Who gets it? The cat shelter, the nurse." She whirled on Derek. "Call the firm. We're contesting this immediately. The entire residue of the estate. Amanda read her voice ringing out clearly now. I leave to my son-in-law, William Carter, in recognition of the years he gave me when my own blood turned away. He is the only family I have left. Derek's head snapped toward William. The look in the hedge fund manager's eyes wasn't anger. It was calculation. He was doing the math, realizing the assets had just jumped across the table. Charlotte stared at William. Her face had gone pale, the makeup standing out like war paint on a corpse. You, she hissed, you manipulated her. You spent 5 years whispering in her ear, didn't you, poisoning her against me while you changed her bedpans. William remained seated. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile. I didn't ask for it, Charlotte, he said quietly. I stayed. That's all I did. I stayed. It's undue influence, Charlotte screamed, slamming her hands on the table. I'll bury you in litigation, William. I'll tie this estate up for decades. You won't see a dime. That money belongs to me. It's my birthright. It was your birthright, Amanda said, closing the folder with a finality that echoed like a gavel. Until you abandoned it. The clause is ironclad, Charlotte. Abandonment and cause of injury. Eleanor was very specific about the wording. At the phrase, cause of injury, Charlotte froze. The color that had rushed to her face in anger drained away instantly, leaving her gray. Her eyes darted to William, wide and fearful. William met her gaze. He saw the flicker of recognition. She knew exactly what that phrase meant. She just didn't know that William knew it too. You can try to sue, William said, standing up slowly. But I wouldn't recommend it. Discovery can be a very messy process. Things come out in court records that are better left buried. Charlotte's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at Derek, but Derek was already pushing his chair back, distancing himself from the blast radius. I think we're done here, William said. Amanda, thank you. Charlotte, Derek, you have until noon to vacate the guest room. I have a lot of work to do. Amanda Foster had left the building, her heels clicking briskly down the front steps as if fleeing a crime scene. The heavy front door thudded shut, leaving the three of them, William, Charlotte, and Derek, suspended in the silence of the dining room. Charlotte didn't leave. She stood by the window, her back to them, her shoulders heaving. When she turned, her face was a mask of pure, distilled hatred. She ignored Derek, who was quietly scrolling through his phone, likely checking flight availability. Her focus was entirely on William. You think you've won, she said, her voice shaking. You think because you charmed a dying woman you get to steal my family's legacy. This isn't over, William. I will drag you through every court in Massachusetts. I will make sure the legal fees alone bankrupt you. There won't be a lawsuit, Charlotte, William said. He remained seated at the head of the table, the position she had claimed the moment she walked in. Watch me, she spat. I'll claim incompetence. I'll claim fraud. I'll paint you as a gold-digging nurse who took advantage of a stroke victim. William stood up. Stay here. He walked out of the room. Charlotte shouted something after him, but he kept walking. He went up the stairs to his bedroom, retrieved the manila envelope and the leather-bound journal from his nightstand, and returned to the dining room. He tossed the envelope onto the polished mahogany table. It slid across the surface and stopped right in front of Derek. What is this? Derek asked, looking up. Insurance, William said. He looked at Charlotte. Open it. Charlotte stared at the envelope. A flicker of genuine fear crossed her eyes, replacing the anger. She knew what files her mother kept. She knew what secrets were buried in this house. I don't want to see your forged papers, she said, her voice wavering. Open it. William's voice cracked like a whip. It was the first time he had raised it in 5 years. Charlotte flinched. Trembling, she reached out and undid the string. She pulled out the photos, the glossy black and white images of her mother's bruised back, the medical report from the private investigator. She dropped them as if they were burning coals. They scattered across the table, images of violence laid out next to the crystal water pitcher. She knew, William said softly. She knew the whole time. No, Charlotte whispered. She backed away until she hit the sideboard. No, she fell. It was an accident. And everyone knows it was an accident. The bruising was inconsistent with a fall, William recited from memory. Consistent with a shove from the upper torso. October 14th. You were arguing about the trust fund. You wanted money for Derek's first firm, didn't you? The one that went under. Derek looked up sharply. He looked at the photos, then at Charlotte. Charlotte! He's lying! Charlotte screamed, tears streaming down her face now. She was unstable. She was drunk. She wrote it down, Charlotte, William said, holding up the journal. She wrote it all down. She lunged. She didn't trip. She lunged. He walked around the table, closing the distance between them. Charlotte shrank back, looking small and terrified. That's why you left, isn't it? William asked, his voice devoid of pity. You didn't leave because the house was depressing. You didn't leave because our marriage was dead. You left because every time you looked at that wheelchair, you saw the evidence of your crime. You ran away to Europe to pretend it never happened. And you left me here to keep your victim alive. I didn't mean to, Charlotte sobbed, collapsing onto a dining chair. I pushed her away. She was screaming at me. It wasn't supposed to. She wasn't supposed to fall, but she did, William said. And instead of calling for help, you waited. You called your lawyer first. And then 5 years later, you ran. The room fell silent, save for Charlotte's jagged breathing. Derek stood up slowly. He picked up the medical report, read the summary, and then looked at Charlotte with a cold, detached expression. He wasn't looking at his lover. He was looking at a liability. A woman who had assaulted her mother, paralyzed her, and was now disinherited and potentially facing criminal charges if this evidence ever left the room. You told me it was a tragic accident, Derek said. You told me she was clumsy. Derek, please, Charlotte reached for his hand. It doesn't matter, we can fight this. Fight? Derek laughed, a harsh, incredulous sound. With this is assault with intent. This is elder abuse. If this gets out, my investors will flee faster than rats on a sinking ship. I can't be associated with this, Charlotte. He dropped the report back onto the table. He looked at William. The will stands. I have no interest in contesting it. Derek, Charlotte shrieked. I'll get my bags, Derek said, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't look back at her. He walked out of the room, leaving Charlotte alone with the wreckage of her lies. William watched him go, then turned back to his wife. She was slumped in the chair, her face buried in her hands. She had lost the money. She had lost the lover. She had lost the lie. You have the townhouse in Paris, William said, his voice tired. It's in your name. Eleanor didn't touch that. Go there. Live your life. But do not ever come back to Boston. William. She looked up, eyes red and swollen. Please. I have nothing else. You have your freedom, William said, picking up the journal. Eleanor gave you that. She kept this secret to her grave so you wouldn't go to prison. That was her final gift to you. Don't waste it. Derek did not wait for her. He had called a private car service the moment he stepped out of the dining room, and within 10 minutes he was gone. He didn't even say goodbye to Charlotte. He simply walked out into the snow with his Louis Vuitton bags, a man cutting a bad investment from his portfolio. Charlotte was left standing in the foyer, her coat buttoned wrong, her face streaked with mascara. She looked around the grand entrance hall of the house she had grown up in, the house she had tried to sell for scrap, the house that had finally rejected her. William stood by the open door, the cold wind blowing and chilling the hallway that he had spent thousands of dollars trying to keep warm for Eleanor. You have a flight to catch, William said. His voice was not unkind, but it was devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a landlord speaking to a tenant who had been evicted. Charlotte picked up her bag. She looked at him, her eyes searching for a trace of the husband she had left 5 years ago, the soft, pliable architect who just wanted to make her happy. She didn't find him. That man had died in this hallway the night he found the note. What will you do? She asked, her voice small. You'll be all alone in this mausoleum. No wife, no career, just ghosts. William looked past her at the spot on the floor where the wheelchair tracks had worn a groove into the wood. I haven't been alone, Charlotte, he said. And I have plenty to do. This house needs a lot of work. The roof leaks in August. Remember, she flinched at her own words being thrown back at her. She tightened her grip on her bag. I hate you, she whispered. I hate that you won. I didn't win, William said simply. I just survived. There's a difference. He stepped back, holding the heavy oak door open. A taxi was idling at the curb, its exhaust puffing white clouds into the gray afternoon air. Go back to Paris, William said. The stipend from the trust will cover your expenses. provided you stay away. If you return to Massachusetts, the journal goes to the district attorney. Do we understand each other? Charlotte nodded a jerky, broken movement. She stepped out onto the porch. She hesitated for a second, looking back at the warmth of the house, perhaps realizing for the first time that she was walking into a winter that would never end for her. Then she turned and hurried down the steps, slipping slightly on the ice before getting into the cab. William watched the car pull away. He watched it turn the corner onto Arlington Street and disappear from view. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel joy. He felt a profound, exhausting lightness, like a heavy pack had been cut from his shoulders. He closed the door. The latch clicked, a solid final sound that echoed through the 3 stories of the brownstone. He locked the deadbolt. He engaged the security chain. He turned back to the empty house. It was silent, truly silent. No oxygen machine humming, no rhythmic wheezing, no footsteps from the guest room. The silence was absolute, vast, and expensive. William walked into the living room. The afternoon light was fading, casting long blue shadows across the floor. He walked to the window and looked out at the public garden across the street where the trees were stripped bare, their branches like black ink against the sky. He was a rich man now. He owned the building, the investments, the legacy. He was 37 years old and he could do whatever he wanted. He could travel. He could start his own firm. He could burn the house down if he felt like it. But as he looked at his reflection in the glass, gray-haired, hollow-cheeked eyes, old beyond their years, he knew the truth. He had traded his youth for this. He had traded his marriage, his ambition, and 5 years of his life to protect a woman who had been a tyrant simply because it was the right thing to do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small key to the library drawer, the spare key he had found in Eleanor's jewelry box that morning. He wouldn't need to break in again. He would keep the journal safe. It was his insurance, but it was also his receipt. He pressed his hand against the cold glass, watching the snow begin to fall harder, bearing the city, bearing the tracks Charlotte's taxi had made, bearing the past. Some debts are paid with money, Charlotte, he whispered to the empty room. Others are paid with time. I've paid yours. William turned away from the window and walked toward the fireplace. He struck a match. It was time to keep the house warm.